I'm very, very pleased to have Susan Colantuono, who's the CEO of Living Women. She's an author. She's an inspiration to many, and we're really pleased to have you here, Susan. Okay, if I don't use the mic, can you hear me? Okay, so in 2012, Marcia Kone, who's one of our other speakers, and I, who are two of Rhode Island, well, we are the two Rhode Island delegates to Vision 2020, worked with a network of other women around the state and produced a report, Vision 2020 Rhode Island, on women, leadership, and wages. Now, I tell you about that because the report gained a little bit of notoriety, and Marcia and I were interviewed about a year ago when candidate Romney's comment about binders full of women kind of caught the attention of a whole bunch of news media, and there was also interest in wage equity, so the Census Bureau data had come up. So Marcia and I were interviewed, and it was quite a long interview of which only a little portion made it onto television. So during the interview, the reporter, who was lovely and did a very nice job overall of the story, she asked us what it would take to close the wage gap. And so Marcia talked about public policy, and I said, okay, Susan, this is your opportunity to make a really great soundbite. If I'm not telling this right, you'll correct me later. I said, okay, there are three things that have to happen in addition to public policy. Three things. Companies have to be more conscientious about doing wage equity audits. Managers have to be held accountable for not creating inequities in their work teams. And women have to get better at negotiating for compensation and benefits. So we left, and we were there at least a half an hour. And so, of course, news stories have to be very short. So we see the news story, and which of the three do you think she focused on as the solution to closing the wage gap? Women have to get better at negotiation. So yes, that's true, but it's not the whole story. So what I want to talk about tonight is, no, it's not all you. Karen already touched on it. We aren't crazy. Gender dynamics impact us at work. So I'm going to talk about things that organizations need to do, things that managers need to do, and things that we need to do. And I'm going to start with pay disparity because it was something that 30% of you identified as an issue in the data that Karen talked about a few minutes ago. And 40% of you said that it was a stressor for your clients and patients. And this was something that we very much cared about in the Vision 2020 report. So we asked how many, well, let me back up. We had the cooperation, thankfully, of 22 of Rhode Island's largest employers, for-profit and not-for-profit, and it was about half and half. So some of your employers are in this data. And we asked them, do you do wage equity audits? And if so, how frequently? So what's a wage equity audit? A wage equity audit is when a company looks at the women and men in like jobs with similar tenure and similar performance. And they look to see if there's pay disparity. And what we discovered was that 28 of the nonprofit respondents conducted wage equity audits at least every other year. So that's kind of a low, we thought that was kind of a low percentage. And 31% of for-profit companies conducted wage equity audits every year or every other year. Again, kind of low. If you don't conduct them regularly, what happens? Yeah, the gaps spread. And the gaps spread for a whole host of reasons. Now, you may have noticed whenever the Census Bureau releases its wage gap data, there's always a flurry well, maybe you haven't noticed, but I've noticed, there's this flurry of countervening stories about, oh, you know, the methodology is flawed and there really isn't a wage gap because now there's this certain small cross-section of women who actually are making more than men. So, yeah, maybe. But here's what's interesting. Of our companies in Rhode Island, the 22 of the largest employers, those that did wage equity audits had to make adjustments to bring compensation back in line. So there is a wage gap, and when they stop doing the wage equity audits, it has an impact on any of us who work in those organizations. So this is something that organizations need to do, and it's something that you could talk to your HR people about, because we cannot fully carry, in those of us who aren't in organizations where wages are stepped, we can't fully carry responsibility for closing the wage gap on our backs and on our skills as negotiators. So it's something for you to think about having a conversation with your HR people about. Now, some of the causes of the wage gap lie in the stereotypes that Karen talked about a little while ago. People assume that women are working just for pin money. That's probably a really dated phrase. I am as old as I look. But other people assume that the man is the breadwinner in the family, and so he has an extra need for compensation. So these stereotypes or assumptions are what I call gender dynamics, because stereotype is like a loaded word. People go, ah, we can't talk about that. These gender dynamics come into play. So we're going to talk a little bit about what some of these gender dynamics are. So imagine this. You wake up, it's a beautiful sunny day, so your spirits are high. It's a good hair day. You all know what that's like. You're wearing something that makes you feel fab. And like Stella, you've got your groove on. Right? So you're on your way into work. And here's something that might happen. So pay attention and see if you can relate to any of what you see.
Comment ça va? Comment ça va? Bien. Tu me tends de la super.
Do we continue to sit on the problem or make a change for good?
Do you recognize anything happening there? So in French, the phrase to sit on the problem is kind of like when we say, are you going to do something about it or not? So that's why there was so much sitting on the women. So what did you see there? What were some of the dynamics that were happening between the women and the men? We were ignored. Right, invisible. What else? Pushed aside.
In the shadow of?
In the shadow of. Right. So I've had those experiences. Have you had experiences like that? So, in part, these dynamics help explain one of the other issues that you thought was important for you and also for your patients. 54% of you said that being passed over for opportunities is an issue, and 30% said that it was a stressor for your patients or clients. So in the Vision 2020 report, and we know that this is a dynamic that happens in workplaces, so we wanted to ask the employers about it. So we asked, does your company have a strategy or philosophy for advancing women? And what we discovered was that nearly all of them do not. Yeah, they don't. And we also asked, do you have targets for percentages of women in senior positions? And again, 100% not. Now this is not uncommon in the US. Most US companies abhor the idea of setting quotas or targets for women at the top. This is very different than in Europe. In Europe, gender equity, which you might suspect from that video, is a really potent political issue, and Marcia will talk a little bit more about that later. But here, they're loath to use targets. So we said, okay, they might not be setting targets. Are they using some successful practices to help women move to the top? So we asked about one that's quite common in the US, which is, when you have open positions at the top, do you require diverse slates of candidates? So if you're using a headhunter or search firm to help fill a job, or if you're working with your internal HR people to fill openings at the top, do you require that there are women and men, people of color and whites? Do you require a diverse candidate slate? And here the results were not all bad. 50% of the for-profit companies require diverse candidate slates. And about 60% of the nonprofit organizations, most of you are working in the nonprofit world, require diverse candidate slates. And they've had some luck in having those slates be presented. So over 50% of the time, companies, most for and not for-profits, had diverse candidate slates presented. So that's good. And this is an important tool. If you are going to set goals, you've got to do something to help women not be passed over for opportunities. So when I talk about gender dynamics, I've had a little bit of interesting experience in the last couple of years, because I structured focus groups to be conducted in 15 different countries around the world. These were focus groups of male managers and of women employees. And what we were looking for is which of the stereotypes or which of the gender dynamics in your countries create the greatest barriers to women's advancement. So impede women's opportunities at the top. And what we discovered is that some of what you saw in the video were on the list of the top 10 worldwide. So the comfort principle, that's one of them. That has to do with the fact that all of us, but in this case when we're looking at men and women, are more comfortable with people who are like us. So this has implications for gender, but it has implications also for race and nationality, ethnicity, and a lot of other differences. But the comfort principle, as it relates to gender, male-woman interactions, means basically that people hire people who are similar to them. They prefer, it's easier to socialize with people who are similar to them. Outside of work, but inside of work, having informal interactions, coaching and mentoring and all of that. The second gender dynamic, which we saw in the film when the guy took the coffee cup from his coworker, is what we call non-parental role expectations, which is when women are expected to be in an assistant kind of role, or sometimes worse, to take the role of a wife, mistress, or lover, because they love talking to us about their problems. And that can really impede our careers, because if they see us in a wife, lover, mistress kind of role, and they're talking about their personal lives, it means they aren't necessarily seeing us as an executive or an administrator. So it's something to watch out for. And then, of course, we saw the insider status of men versus the outsider status of women. So these were three that were portrayed in the video, and I wanted to name them for you. But because we're talking business,